I never expected my parents' vintage grandfather clock to sound so ominous, but as I sat in their formal living room that Sunday afternoon, each tick felt like a countdown to something terrible. My name is Rebecca Mitchell, Becca to most, and at 35, I thought I'd finally earned my place in the world as a successful interior designer with my own small but thriving firm in Boston. That afternoon, I'd driven the familiar route to my parents' colonial-style home in Wellesley, Massachusetts, expecting our monthly family dinner. What I didn't expect was to find my older brother James's Range Rover and my younger sister Olivia's Tesla already parked in the circular driveway. They were never early to anything. When Mom opened the door, her pearl necklace perfectly matched her cream cashmere sweater, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rebecca, dear, everyone's waiting in the study," she said, giving me a quick hug that felt perfunctory. The study was my father's domain, reserved for serious conversations and business meetings. My stomach tightened as I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors my father was so proud of. James and Olivia sat in the leather armchairs across from our father's imposing mahogany desk, both unnaturally stiff. Dad stood beside his attorney, Harold Preston, a man I'd known since childhood, but whose presence suddenly felt ominous. "Becca, thank you for coming," Dad said formally, as though I'd responded to a business invitation rather than our regular family dinner. "Your mother and I have been thinking about the future. At our age, it's important to have everything in order." I nodded, settling into the remaining chair, noticing my siblings wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "We've drafted our will," Mom continued, her voice steady and practiced. "We thought it best to discuss it now, while we're still healthy, so there are no surprises later." Harold placed a document in front of each of us. I scanned the pages, my vision blurring as I processed what I was reading. The family home, worth nearly $2 million, would go to James. The vacation property in Nantucket, worth even more, would go to Olivia. The bulk of their investment portfolio would be divided 60-40 between my siblings. And me? I would receive my grandmother's jewelry collection and a small trust fund, less than 10% of what each of my siblings would inherit. "You've always been so independent, Becca," Dad said, as though this explained everything. "James will take over the business, and Olivia has her medical practice to establish. They'll need more resources." I felt my breath catch. "And what about the house renovations I helped finance? The deed?" Mom cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "Don't take it personally, Becca. This is about practicality, not feelings." "Don't take it personally." The words rang in my ears as my siblings nodded along, looking uncomfortable but not particularly surprised. It was then I remembered something they seemed to have conveniently forgotten. My name was still on the deed to the family home, added. 7 years ago, when I'd contributed a significant portion of my savings to help them avoid a second mortgage during renovations. That deed was about to become very personal indeed. The Mitchells were a name that carried weight in our corner of Massachusetts. Not old money like the families with streets named after them, but respected new money built on my father's shrewd business acumen and my mother's family connections. Richard Mitchell started as a carpenter and built Mitchell Construction into a company that now developed luxury homes across New England. My mother, Eleanor, came from the Caldwell family, not Fortune 500 wealthy, but comfortable enough that she'd never known financial hardship before marrying Dad. Growing up, I learned early that achievement was the Mitchell family currency. As the middle child, I existed in a precarious balance between James, the golden boy who could do no wrong, and Olivia, the baby genius who skipped 2 grades and became the family prodigy. James was groomed from childhood to take over Mitchell Construction. Even his childhood bedroom had blueprints framed on the walls, and Dad took him to construction sites before he could ride a bike. When James followed Dad into Dartmouth and then returned with his MBA to become the company's COO, Dad threw him a party that lasted all weekend. Olivia was Mom's project. Brilliant, beautiful, and born with a competitive streak that made her the perfect candidate for Mom's medical ambitions. Mom had wanted to be a doctor herself but married Dad instead, so when Olivia showed aptitude in science, Mom threw all her energy into creating the doctor she never became. Piano lessons, science camps, volunteer work at hospitals. Olivia's schedule was packed from age 7, and it paid off when she got into Harvard Medical School. And then there was me. I had always been creative, preferring art classes to science labs, design magazines to business journals. When I announced I wanted to study interior design, Dad laughed and asked when I'd get serious. Mom suggested it might make a nice hobby alongside a real degree in business. The first major rift came when I rejected my admission to Boston University's business program and instead enrolled in Parsons School of Design in New York. "You're throwing away your potential," Dad said the night before I left. "This family has a legacy to uphold." That word, legacy, became the measuring stick against which all my choices were judged and found wanting. When I graduated with honors and landed a job with a prestigious design firm in Manhattan, they sent a card but didn't attend the ceremony. James had a business conference that weekend, and Mom wanted to be there to support him. Olivia was taking summer courses to graduate early, so she couldn't make it either. The pattern continued through my 20s, my achievements acknowledged but never celebrated, my visits home punctuated by subtle comparisons to my siblings' milestones. "James just closed a 7-figure deal," Dad would mention over dinner. Or Olivia's research paper was published in a major medical journal, Mom would announce while passing the potatoes. When I won a design award for repurposing historic buildings, Mom said it was nice, and immediately pivoted to Olivia's medical school graduation. The favoritism was never explicitly acknowledged. That wasn't the Mitchell way. Instead, it came in the form of Mom calling my siblings 3 times a week, but me once a month. It showed in the family photos displayed in their home, James's wedding portrait in the center of the mantle, Olivia's white coat ceremony prominently on Dad's desk, while my graduation photo was tucked in a smaller frame on a side table. Even at Christmas, the inequity was evident in the gifts. James receiving a Rolex for his executive position, Olivia getting a down payment for her condo, because doctors shouldn't have to worry about housing, while I received nice but impersonal gifts like scarves or kitchen appliances. During our last Thanksgiving, as we sat around the dining table I had helped redesign 2 years earlier, for free, as a gift to them, Dad raised a toast to the Mitchell legacy continuing through each generation, his eyes lingering on James, and Olivia but passing over me as though I were invisible. Later that night, I overheard Mom in the kitchen with Aunt Sarah, my father's sister. "Rebecca just hasn't found her place yet," she said, even though I owned my own design firm by then. "Some children just take longer to become what their parents hoped for." I had never quite measured up to being what they hoped for, but I'd always consoled myself with the belief that they loved me equally, if differently. The will meeting shattered that illusion completely. As I drove home that night, Harold's words echoed in my mind. "This distribution reflects your parents' wishes for preserving the family legacy." Their legacy, it seemed, had always been designed for just 2/3 of their children. The family study had always intimidated me. Unlike the rest of the house that I'd helped redecorate over the years, this room remained unchanged, a shrine to traditional masculinity with its dark walnut paneling, hunter green leather furniture, and bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that I doubted anyone had actually read. Oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors from Mom's side stared down disapprovingly, as if judging my fashion choices or career decisions. On this particular afternoon, the room felt smaller than usual, the air heavy with expectation and something else I couldn't quite identify yet. Betrayal, perhaps. Harold Preston sat in Dad's usual chair behind the desk, a position that seemed to symbolize the power shift occurring. At 72, Harold was the picture of old-school legal authority, with his wire-rimmed glasses and meticulously trimmed white beard. He'd handled the Mitchell family's legal affairs since before I was born, and I'd always liked him. Until now. Harold cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. "I'll summarize the key provisions for clarity, though you each have the full document before you," he began, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had mediated many family conflicts over inheritance. The family residence at 47 Sherwood Lane, assessed value $1,800,000, transfers in full to James Richard Mitchell. I glanced at James, who nodded slightly, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. He fidgeted with his Rolex, Dad's gift from 2 Christmases ago. "The Nantucket vacation property at 824 Ocean View Drive, assessed value $2,300,000, transfers in full to Olivia Eleanor Mitchell." Olivia tucked a strand of her perfect blonde hair behind her ear, her Harvard eye. medical school ring catching the light. Her eyes remained fixed on the document, not meeting my gaze. The Mitchell Construction Group shares, currently valued at approximately $6 million, will be distributed with 60% to James Richard Mitchell and 40% to Olivia Eleanor Mitchell, with the understanding that James will maintain controlling interest as CEO. I felt my heart rate increasing, a slight tremor developing in my hands that I tried to hide by gripping the armrests of my chair. The investment portfolio, approximately $4 million, will be divided with 60% to James Richard Mitchell and 40% to Olivia Eleanor Mitchell. Each time my siblings' names were mentioned, another piece of my family connection seemed to crumble away. I waited for my name, for some equivalent share, for some acknowledgement of my place in this family. To Rebecca Ann Mitchell, Harold finally said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. The Eleanor Caldwell jewelry collection, appraised value $120,000, and a trust fund in the amount of $300,000 to be administered by Mitchell Financial Services. My mother's hand reached over to pat mine. The jewelry is family heirloom quality, dear. I know how you've always admired my mother's pieces. $300,000 against the millions my siblings would receive. It felt like a rounding error, an afterthought. I stared at Harold, waiting for the punchline, for the just kidding moment that wouldn't come. Is there a reason? I finally asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Dad leaned forward, his CEO posture engaged. Becca, James is taking over the family business. He needs the liquidity and assets to maintain our market position. Olivia is establishing her medical practice and will eventually have tremendous student loans to repay. Your design business is already successful, and you've always been so independent. Independent? I repeated. Is that code for not part E of the legacy? Mom's pearl necklace clicked softly as she shook her head. This isn't about favoritism, Rebecca. It's about practical considerations for the future. The future of Mitchell Construction, Dad added. The future of the Caldwell medical tradition, Mom said simultaneously. And there it was, the unspoken truth that I'd always felt but never heard stated so plainly. I wasn't part of either legacy they valued. James cleared his throat. Becca, if you need anything, you know I'll always help you out. The condescension in his offer made my skin crawl. I was being relegated to the role of poor relation who might need to ask for handouts. Olivia, ever the peacemaker, added, We can talk about shared use of the Nantucket house. I know how much you love it there. So I could be a guest in the vacation home where I'd spent every childhood summer, where I'd helped design the new kitchen 2 years ago. Harold was watching me carefully. I wondered how many family divisions he'd witnessed over the years from behind that professional mask. Are there any questions about the provisions as outlined? He asked. I had 1,000 questions. Why was I worth so much less than my siblings in my parents' eyes? Why did the renovations I helped finance not count as part of my contribution? To the family? Why did they conveniently forget that my name was on the deed to this very house? Instead, I asked, May I have a copy to review privately? Of course, Harold replied, sliding a folder toward me. Nothing is finalized yet. This is still a draft, though your parents have indicated these provisions reflect their wishes. Dad nodded firmly. We just want what's best for the family. Legacy, Becca, don't take it personally. Those words again. Don't take it personally. As if disinheriting your middle child was a business decision, like changing office suppliers. As if my exclusion from their vision of family legacy wasn't the most personal rejection possible. I carefully placed the document in my bag, my designer training kicking in as I maintained a neutral expression. I understand completely, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. If you'll excuse me, I have an early client meeting tomorrow. I didn't, but I needed to leave before my composure cracked. As I walked to the door, Harold called after me. Rebecca, we should talk privately sometime, about the details. His tone suggested there was more he couldn't say in front of my family. I nodded without turning back, not trusting myself to speak further. I made it all the way to my car before the first tear fell. The 15-mile drive from Wellesley to my downtown Boston condo passed in a blur of automatic movements and racing thoughts. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and I caught myself holding my breath until spots danced in my vision. Twice I had to pull over because tears made it impossible to see the road. A Taylor Swift song about betrayal played on the radio, and I violently punched the power button, preferring silence to any soundtrack for this moment. My body seemed to be processing the shock before my mind could. My chest felt tight, my stomach churned, and a persistent tremor had taken up residence in my hands. By the time I reached my building's underground parking, I was experiencing what I recognized as the physical symptoms of emotional trauma: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, cold sweats. The security guard in the lobby asked if I was feeling all right, and I mumbled something about a stomach bug before escaping to the elevator. Once inside my condo, a space I'd designed to be my sanctuary with its clean lines, calming blue-gray palette, and carefully curated art collection, I kicked off my heels and collapsed onto my sofa. The pristine space that usually brought me such comfort now felt hollow, as though the revelation of my place in my family had somehow diminished my carefully constructed adult life. I poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet but couldn't bring myself to drink it. Instead, I sat motionless, staring at the framed family photo on my bookshelf, taken at James's wedding 3 years ago, all of us smiling as though we were the perfect family. Had I been the only one who believed that fiction? As the shock began to recede, memories flooded in, unwelcome but insistent. I remembered the summer I'd postponed an important business trip to care for my grandmother during her final illness, while my siblings continued their vacations, citing critical work commitments. Dad had thanked me perfunctorily, as though I'd picked up his dry cleaning rather than provided weeks of round-the-clock care for his dying mother. I recalled countless weekends during college when I'd driven home to help at the family business, drafting design proposals for client presentations while James was away at fraternity events. Mom had called it good experience, rather than the unpaid labor it actually was. Most painfully, I remembered the house renovation 7 years ago, the one that had nearly depleted my savings but had seemed worth it at the time. My parents had been caught in a financial squeeze when a major development project went over budget. They needed to renovate their aging home, but didn't want to take a second mortgage that might reflect poorly on the company's financial stability. I'd offered my savings, nearly $200,000 that I'd been planning to use as a down payment on my own home. "We'll put your name on the deed," Dad had said. "It's only right since you're investing in the property." Mom had added, "It protects everyone this way." I had the paperwork somewhere, had signed it at Harold's office, in fact. The signing had felt like a moment of finally being accepted as an equal in the family, of contributing meaningfully to the Mitchell legacy. Now it seemed like a detail they'd conveniently forgotten. My phone began to buzz with texts from my sister. "Hope you're okay. Remember they love you. Just be grateful for what you have. Just be grateful. For being treated as less than. For being excluded from my own family's future. For being patted on the head with trinkets while my siblings received millions." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Around midnight, exhaustion finally overcame my racing thoughts, but sleep brought no relief. I dreamed of standing outside my parents' home, looking through the windows at my family celebrating together, unable to hear me knocking on the glass. I woke at 4 a.m., drenched in sweat and feeling more alone than I ever had. The question that had haunted me since childhood resurfaced with new intensity. What did I do wrong? Was choosing a different career path really so unforgivable? Was being independent truly a justification for being cut out of my family's legacy? Dawn found me at my desk, sending an email to my assistant to reschedule my appointments for the day. For the first time in my professional life, I was taking an unplanned day off. I needed time to think, to plan, to understand what had happened and what I could do about it. And I needed to find that folder with the house deed, the document. That might be my only leverage in a situation where I suddenly felt powerless. My apartment has always been meticulously organized, a professional hazard of being a designer who specializes in functional spaces. So it took me less than 20 minutes to locate the accordion file labeled Family Documents in my home office. Inside, behind my birth certificate and passport copies, I found the folder I was looking for. Mitchell Family Home, 2016 renovation. My hands trembled slightly as I spread the contents across my desk. Financial statements showing my wire transfer of $187,500 to my parents' account. The contractor agreements for the renovation work, some of which I had personally negotiated, using my industry connections to save thousands. Design sketches I'd created for the new kitchen and master bathroom. And there it was. The property deed with 3 names listed as joint owners: Richard Mitchell, Eleanor Mitchell, and Rebecca Mitchell. I stared at my name on the official document, remembering the day we'd signed it in Harold's office. This makes the most sense from both a financial and legal standpoint, Harold had explained. Since Rebecca is contributing substantially to the property's improvement and value, adding her to the deed protects her investment and simplifies any future estate considerations. Dad had nodded approvingly, clapping me on the shoulder. Smart business move all around, he'd said, and it keeps everything in the family. Mom had seemed pleased, too, commenting that it formalized my contribution to the family legacy in a way that had made me feel, finally, like I belonged. Now, 7 years later, that same family legacy was being divided between my siblings, as though my name weren't on this very document, as though my contribution had never existed. I photographed the deed with my phone, then carefully returned the original to its folder. They couldn't have simply forgotten, could they? The alternative, that they remembered but chose to ignore it, felt even worse. Either way, this document changed everything about yesterday's will reading. I spent the next 3 days in a research spiral, taking additional time off work that I justified to my concerned assistant as a family matter. I scoured legal websites about property law in Massachusetts, read everything I could find about joint ownership, inheritance rights, and contested wills. I joined online forums for people dealing with family estate issues, reading stories that both validated my feelings and terrified me about the potential fallout. On Thursday morning, I finally made an appointment with Susan Chan, an estate attorney recommended by my business lawyer. Susan's office was nothing like Harold's wood-paneled shrine to tradition. Her space was modern, with clean lines and contemporary art that immediately put me at ease. Susan herself, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened without interruption as I explained my situation, only asking the occasional clarifying question. When I finished pushing the copy of the deed across her desk, she studied it carefully before looking up. "Based on what you've shown me, you have significant legal standing here," she said. "This is a properly executed deed showing joint ownership, with right of survivorship. Your financial contribution is well documented. If your parents proceed with a will that ignores your ownership interest in the property, you would have strong grounds to contest it." The validation from an objective professional unleashed emotions I hadn't realized I was still suppressing. To my horror, I burst into tears in Susan's office. She calmly pushed a box of tissues toward me. "This happens more often than you'd think," she said gently. "Family estate issues are never just about money or property. They're about recognition, fairness, and often decades of complicated relationships." When I'd composed myself, Susan outlined my options. I could wait until the will was finalized and then contest it, which would likely result in lengthy and expensive litigation. I could proactively assert my property rights now, before anything was finalized. Or I could try to resolve the matter privately with my family first, armed with the knowledge of my legal position, but hoping for an amicable solution. "Whatever you decide," Susan advised, "document everything from this point forward. Every conversation, every email, every text, and be prepared for this to change your family dynamics permanently, regardless of the outcome." That evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the Boston skyline transition from sunset to dusk, my phone rang. It was James. "Hey, Beck," he said, using the childhood nickname he only trotted out when he wanted something. "Just checking in. You seemed upset on Sunday. Are you over it yet?" Over it yet? As though my exclusion from my family's future was a minor disappointment, like a canceled dinner reservation. "I'm processing," I replied neutrally. Good, he said, sounding distracted. "Listen, Mom and Dad are hoping we can all get together again next weekend. They want to finalize everything with Harold. Can you make it Sunday?" The casual way, he assumed I would simply show up and sign away my inheritance, my place in the family, my name on a deed I'd paid for. Something shifted inside me. All my life, I'd been the peacemaker, the one who accommodated everyone else's needs while minimizing my own. In that moment, on my balcony with the city lights coming alive below me, I asked myself the question that would change everything. Have I always let people walk over me? I'll be there, I told James, my voice steadier than it had been all week. I have some things I need to discuss with everyone. After hanging up, I emailed Susan to schedule a follow-up appointment. I wanted to try resolving this with my family first, one last attempt at the amicable solution, but I would be going into that family meeting with a clear understanding of my rights and a newfound determination to stand up for myself. The week before the family meeting felt like preparing for the most important client presentation of my career. I organized my documentation chronologically in a crisp black portfolio folder. The wire transfer receipt, the renovation contracts, the property deed with all 3 signatures clearly visible, and printouts of relevant Massachusetts property laws that Susan had provided. I rehearsed what I would say, practicing in front of my bathroom mirror until I could deliver my points calmly and factually, without the emotional wavering that might undermine my position. I even scheduled a session with my therapist, Dr. Martinez, whom I hadn't seen in over a year, to help prepare for the psychological impact of confronting my family. Remember that their reaction will be about them, not about you, she advised. You're simply stating facts and asking for what's legally yours. Their discomfort with that doesn't invalidate your position. Sunday arrived with perfect fall weather, the kind of crisp New England day that usually lifted my spirits. I chose my outfit carefully, a charcoal gray pantsuit that projected professionalism without seeming overly formal for a family dinner, paired with subtle jewelry and low heels. Power dressing, but with restraint. I arrived exactly on time, neither early enough to seem eager nor late enough to seem reluctant. Mom had prepared her signature pot roast, the meal she always made when she wanted to create an atmosphere of family tradition and comfort. The familiar aroma hit me as I entered, momentarily weakening my resolve with childhood memories of happier times. We engaged in strained small talk through the appetizer course, James discussing a new development project, Olivia sharing anecdotes from her residency, me contributing minimal information about my latest design client. Mom and Dad exchanged glances across the table, clearly pleased with how normal everything seemed. It wasn't until dessert, Mom's apple pie with vanilla ice cream, another family tradition, that Dad cleared his throat and mentioned the business at hand. Harold has the final documents prepared, he said, cutting precisely into his pie. We can review them quickly after dinner and get everything signed. No need to drag it out. The dismissive tone, the assumption that I would simply go along with their plan, strengthened my determination. I set down my dessert spoon, untouched pie still on my plate. Before we do that, I said, my voice remarkably steady, there's something important we need to discuss. I retrieved my portfolio from my bag and removed the property deed, placing it in the center of the dining table. 7 years ago, when I contributed nearly $200,000 to the house renovation, my name was added to the deed as a joint owner. This doesn't seem to be reflected in the will provisions. The silence that followed was absolute. Dad's fork hovered midway to his mouth, then slowly lowered back to his plate. Mom's hand went to her pearl necklace, fingering it nervously. James and Olivia exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. That was just a formality, Dad finally said, his tone dismissive. A temporary measure during the renovation financing. I maintained eye contact with him. That's not what was discussed at the time. Harold specifically explained that adding me to the deed protected my investment and, in his words, simplified future estate considerations. I have the documentation of both my financial contribution and the legal change to the property ownership. Mom's expression hardened. Rebecca, surely you don't intend to cause problems over this, after everything we've done for you? The familiar guilt tactic that had always worked before, implying that I was ungrateful, difficult, not a team player. This time, I didn't take the bait. I'm not causing problems, Mom. I'm simply pointing out a legal fact that affects the estate planning. My name is on the deed, which means I own 1/3 of this house. James pushed his chair back from the table, his face flushing. This is exactly why they're right not to trust you with the legacy, he snapped. The moment you don't get what you want, you threaten to tear apart everything Dad built. I'm not threatening anything, I countered, keeping my voice level. I'm stating a legal fact about property ownership, a fact that everyone in this room was aware of when we signed the papers. Olivia, always the strategic one, tried a different approach. Becca, think about what this would do to Mom and Dad. They're trying to plan responsibly for the future. Do you really want to cause them this stress at their age? The implication was clear. If anything happened to our parents, it would be my fault for upsetting them. Another manipulation tactic I recognized from childhood disagreements. I believe they're strong enough to have an honest conversation about legal realities, I replied. This isn't about causing stress. It's about acknowledging my contribution to this family and this property. Dad's CEO persona took over, his voice adopting the tone he used when shutting down disagreement in board meetings. That contribution was appreciated, Rebecca, but it doesn't entitle you to dictate the terms of our will. We've made our decision based on what's best for the family business and legacy. Your decision ignores a legal document that gives me ownership rights to this property, I said, tapping the deed. That's not something a will can simply override. Mom's eyes narrowed. This is exactly why we made the decisions we did, Rebecca. You've always been so focused on yourself, on what you think you deserve. James and Olivia understand family obligation. They understand sacrifice for the greater good. The comment stung exactly as it was meant to, hitting my lifelong insecurity about not measuring up to my siblings. But this time, instead of retreating into apologetic compliance, I stood my ground. I understand family obligation very well, Mom. I understood it when I gave up my own home down payment to help with this renovation. I understood it when I spent 3 weeks caring for Grandma while everyone else was too busy. I've sacrificed plenty for this family. The difference is that my sacrifices have never been acknowledged or valued the same way James's and Olivia's have been. The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there. James accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. Olivia suggested I might be having some kind of breakdown and offered to refer me to a therapist colleague. Dad alternated between stony silence and cutting remarks about my artistic temperament, making me overly emotional about business matters. Mom retreated into injured martyrdom, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin while murmuring about how she'd always tried to treat all her children equally. When Dad finally issued his ultimatum, just sign a quitclaim deed releasing your interest in the property, and we'll forget this happened, I knew the attempt at resolution had failed completely. I carefully returned the deed to my portfolio and stood up. I won't be signing anything today. I suggest we all take some time to reconsider the situation. I'm happy to discuss a fair resolution when everyone is ready to acknowledge the legal reality. As I gathered my things to leave, Mom followed me to the door. This isn't about money, she said, her voice low. This is about your father's legacy. Why can't you respect that? I turned to face her, suddenly exhausted by decades of trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I didn't measure up. You're right, Mom. This isn't about money. It's about respect. It's about acknowledging that I'm just as much a part of this family as James and Olivia. It's about recognizing that my contribution matters too. I could feel tears threatening but refused to let them fall. When you're ready to have that conversation, I'll be here. I walked to my car with as much dignity as I could muster, not breaking down until I was safely driving away from the property that was legally 1/3 mine but had never felt less like home. The week following the disastrous family dinner passed in a fog of minimal contact with my family. Mom left one voicemail asking if I was ready to be reasonable yet. James sent a text suggesting I stop creating drama and think about someone besides yourself for once. Olivia emailed links to articles about family therapy, passive-aggressively highlighting sections about problem family members who disrupt harmony. I responded to none of them, focusing instead on reclaiming my equilibrium. My best friend Lydia, who had witnessed the Mitchell family dynamics for 20 years, came over with takeout Thai food and a fierce protectiveness that felt like a life raft. They've always done this to you, she said, angrily stabbing at her pad thai. Made you feel like wanting equal treatment is somehow asking for special treatment? It's gaslighting, Becca, and you've been putting up with it your entire life. My assistant, Marta, noticed my distraction at work and quietly rearranged my schedule to give me space for important client meetings while handling routine matters herself. "Family stuff is tough," she said simply, not prying but offering quiet support. Even my building's doorman, Eddie, seemed to sense something was wrong, making a point to ask how I was doing and mentioning that my usually vibrant energy seemed dimmed. These small acts of concern from the people in my daily life threw into sharp relief how differently my own family treated me. I began to recognize a pattern that had defined my life for so long I'd stopped seeing it. I consistently put my family's needs and expectations first, often at significant personal cost, while they rarely extended the same consideration to me. I thought about the design career I loved, but had constantly downplayed and apologized for around my family. I remembered holidays rearranged to accommodate James's and Olivia's schedules, but never mine. Birthdays where my gifts were practical, while my siblings received experiences or luxury items, and countless times when I'd swallowed hurt feelings to keep the peace when my accomplishments were minimized. On Wednesday, I kept my rescheduled appointment with Dr. Martinez, my therapist. Rather than our usual catch-up session, I found myself pouring out years of accumulated hurts, realizations, and questions. Why have I allowed them to make me feel less valuable for so long? I asked, wiping away tears of frustration. Why do I still crave approval from people who have shown repeatedly that they don't value me equally? Dr. Martinez's response was gentle but unflinching. "You've been conditioned since childhood to prioritize family harmony over your own needs, Becca. It's a common pattern in family systems, especially for middle children. The question now is, knowing what you know about this pattern, what do you want to do differently going forward?" That question lingered with me as I left her office and walked through the Boston Public Garden, watching families enjoying the early fall weather. A mother knelt to tie her young daughter's shoelace, then kissed her forehead before doing the same for her son. The simple gesture of equal attention and care made my throat tight with emotion. By the time I reached the other side of the garden, something had shifted inside me. I no longer wanted to prove my worth to my family. I wanted to claim it for myself. I no longer needed their validation to know my own value. My second meeting with Susan Chan was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. This time, I arrived with a clearer sense of purpose. "I've attempted to resolve this privately," I told her, "but my family is unwilling to acknowledge my legal interest in the property. What are my options now?" Susan outlined a strategic approach. First, she would send a formal letter to Harold Preston, attorney to attorney, detailing my legal position and requesting a proper accounting of my ownership interest in any estate planning. If that didn't prompt a productive discussion, we could file for a declaratory judgment to confirm my property rights. "I should warn you," she said, "once legal correspondence starts, your family will likely feel threatened. This could escalate quickly, especially if they've been surprised by your standing up for yourself. Are you prepared for that?" I considered her question carefully. I've spent my entire life trying to avoid conflicts with my family by accommodating their expectations and minimizing my own needs. Where has that gotten me? I'm ready to advocate for myself now, even if it's uncomfortable. Susan nodded approvingly. "One more thing you should know," she added. "Harold Preston called me yesterday. He said he's been trying to reach you." This surprised me. "Why would he call you?" He wouldn't say specifically, citing attorney-client privilege, but he implied that there might be details about the property deed and your parents' estate planning that would be relevant to our discussions. He suggested a private meeting with you. I immediately felt suspicious. Was this another attempt at manipulation? A way to pressure me into compliance without my own legal representation? "I'd prefer any discussions to happen with you present," I told Susan. "And I'd prefer formal legal correspondence to establish the record clearly." Susan smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I told him you'd say. I've scheduled a call with him tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'll draft that letter for your review." As I left Susan's office, my phone rang. It was Harold himself, trying once more for direct contact. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. "Rebecca, I believe there are aspects of this situation that would benefit from a private discussion between us. Please call me at your earliest convenience." His tone was professional, but had an undertone of urgency I'd never heard from him before. I texted him back. "Harold, I've retained Susan Chan to represent me in this matter. Please direct all communication through her office. Thank you for understanding." 10 minutes later, as I was unlocking my apartment door, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Rebecca Mitchell," I said professionally. "Rebecca, this is Harold's assistant, Diane. He asked me to call from my personal phone. He says it's extremely important that you meet with him privately before legal proceedings begin. He says," she lowered her voice, "there are documents you need to see that aren't in the official files." My instinct for self-protection warred with curiosity. "What documents?" "He wouldn't tell me, but he seemed concerned, Rebecca. I've worked with him for 20 years and I've never seen him this worried about a client matter." I considered for a moment, then made my decision. "Please tell Harold that I appreciate his concern, but I'm not comfortable meeting without my attorney present. Any documents he believes I should see can be shared through proper legal channels." As I ended the call, I felt a surprising sense of calm. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, I was prioritizing my own interests rather than accommodating everyone else's expectations and demands. It felt uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and absolutely right. Susan's formal letter to Harold was sent on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, my phone was blowing up with notifications. A text from James. "What the hell, Becca? Lawyers? Really?" A voicemail from Mom, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Rebecca Ann, call me immediately. This is not how we handle family matters." 3 missed calls from Dad's office line. A surprisingly measured email from Olivia suggesting we talk sister to sister before this gets out of hand. I forwarded the email to Susan, ignored the rest, and focused on my work, presenting design concepts to a new restaurant client whose faith in my creative vision felt like a much-needed counterbalance to my family's dismissal. Tuesday brought the first formal response, a letter from Harold to Susan expressing disappointment in the adversarial approach and reiterating my parents' position that my name on the deed was a temporary accommodation that was never intended to create permanent ownership rights. Susan called this wishful legal thinking and began preparing our response. Wednesday morning, I was reviewing fabric samples with my assistant when the office receptionist called. "Your father is here to see you," she said, clearly uncomfortable. "He doesn't have an appointment." The Mitchell approach to conflict had always been to overwhelm through direct confrontation, preferably on their terms and their territory. I took a deep breath, smoothed my skirt, and went to meet him in our office lobby. Dad stood near the reception desk, looking distinctly out of place among the contemporary design elements. At 68, Richard Mitchell still cut an imposing figure in his tailored suit and polished wingtips, his silver hair perfectly groomed. The expression on his face, a mixture of authority and disappointment, was one I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood. "Rebecca," he said formally, as though we were business acquaintances. "We need to talk." I maintained my professional composure, aware of my staff watching curiously. "I'm in the middle of client work, Dad. If you'd like to schedule a time to speak, my assistant can help with that." The muscle in his jaw tightened, a telltale sign of his rising temper that I'd learned to watch for as a child. This is family business. It takes priority. In the past, I would have acquiesced immediately, dropping everything to accommodate his demand. Instead, I said calmly, "I'll be finished in about an hour. If you'd like to wait or come back then, I'm happy to talk, but I won't abandon my professional obligations without notice." I turned to my receptionist. "Jenny, could you please offer my father coffee and the use of our conference room if he'd like to wait?" Dad looked genuinely shocked at not getting his way immediately. After a moment of visible internal struggle, he said, "I'll wait," in a tone that suggested I was testing his considerable patience. I returned to my client meeting, focusing with some difficulty on the restaurant color scheme, while knowing my father was seething in our conference room. When I finally joined him an hour later, he launched immediately into his speech. "This legal nonsense stops now, Rebecca. Your mother is beside herself. James is furious. Even Harold is concerned about the direction this is taking. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Now withdraw your lawyer's letter and let's move forward as a family. I sat across from him, hands folded on the conference table. I'm not trying to make a point, Dad. I'm asserting my legal rights as a property owner, rights that you and Mom acknowledged when you added me to the deed. That was a temporary measure during the financing. You know that. That's not what the document says, and it's not what Harold explained when we signed it. There was no mention of it being temporary. In fact, he specifically described it as protecting my investment for the future. Dad's expression darkened. You're deliberately misinterpreting the situation because you're unhappy with the will. This is emotional manipulation, Rebecca. And it's beneath you. The accusation stung, but I maintained my composure. This isn't about emotions, Dad. It's about legal facts. My name is on the deed. I contributed a significant amount to the property. Those are verifiable facts, not emotional interpretations. He leaned forward, switching tactics. Think about what you're doing to this family. Your mother can barely sleep. James is talking about cutting off contact with you completely. Is that what you want? To destroy your family over money? The familiar guilt tactic almost worked. I felt the instinctive urge to apologize, to smooth things over, to prioritize family harmony over my own interests. But then I remembered Dr. Martinez's question. What did I want to do differently going forward? What I want, I said carefully, is to be treated with the same respect and consideration as James and Olivia. What I want is for my contributions to be acknowledged rather than minimized or forgotten when convenient. What I want is equity, Dad. He stood abruptly. Well, what I want is a daughter who understands family loyalty. Clearly, I don't have that. He walked out without another word, leaving me shaking but still resolved. The fallout intensified over the following weeks. James called to inform me I was no longer welcome at his home. Not while you're attacking our parents like this. Mom. Texted daily emotional appeals. How could you do this to us after all we've done for you? And this isn't how we raised you to behave. The extended family got involved after Thanksgiving plans were disrupted. Aunts called to understand both sides. Uncles emailed their unsolicited legal opinions. Cousins took public positions on social media about family loyalty versus greed. A grocery store encounter with my mother's bridge club resulted in pointed comments about ungrateful children, loud enough for everyone in the produce section to hear. The pressure was relentless and came from all directions. I lost 7 pounds. I couldn't afford to lose. Anxiety attacks woke me at 3 a.m. Dark circles became a permanent feature under my eyes, requiring increased concealer for client meetings. Through it all, I maintained my position. In letters from Susan, in brief, factual responses to family members who reached out directly, in a single phone conversation with Olivia that ended with her in tears, and me feeling simultaneously guilty and justified. One particularly bad night, after receiving a scathing email from a beloved aunt who had only heard my parents' version of events, I nearly called Susan to withdraw everything. What was I doing? Was property ownership worth destroying? My family relationships? Was standing up for myself worth this constant ache in my chest, this persistent nausea, this profound loneliness? I went to my bookshelf and pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years, my childhood diaries preserved through multiple moves. I began reading entries from age 12, 13, 14, and found a pattern I'd forgotten. Mom was so proud of James's science fair project. Mine got second place, but she just said, "That's nice," and changed the subject. Dad took James and Olivia to the baseball game, but said there wasn't an extra ticket for me. I'm fine staying home anyway. Got straight A's again, but nobody noticed, because Olivia skipped a grade this year. Asked if I could redecorate my room. Mom said maybe next year. They're redoing James's room now because he's the oldest and needs a proper study space. Page after page documented small inequities, constant comparisons, achievements overlooked, needs deprioritized. The consistency was striking and heartbreaking. I hadn't been imagining it. The pattern had been there all along, so pervasive I'd normalized it. That night, I wrote a new entry, my first in over 15 years. Today, I realized that standing up for yourself can be the loneliest choice you ever make. But failing to stand up for yourself guarantees a different kind of loneliness. The kind where you're surrounded by people who don't truly see you. I'm choosing the temporary loneliness of conflict over the permanent loneliness of erasure. The next morning, I emailed Susan. Please proceed with the declaratory judgment filing. I'm ready for whatever comes next. The mediation meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday in early December at a neutral conference room in Susan's law firm. I arrived 20 minutes early, reviewing our documentation one last time while trying to manage my anxiety with the breathing techniques Dr. Martinez had taught me. Susan joined me shortly after, her calm confidence bolstering my wavering resolve. Remember, she said, straightening her already immaculate blazer, this isn't about winning or losing. It's about establishing legal facts and finding a fair resolution. You have a strong position. Just stay focused on that, not on family dynamics. My parents arrived exactly on time, Harold Preston escorting them like a protective guardian. Mom looked thinner than I remembered, her usually perfect, makeup not quite concealing the fatigue around her eyes. Dad maintained his stern CEO expression, but I noticed his hand trembling slightly as he placed his briefcase on the table. James and Olivia had not been invited to this meeting, though I knew they would be getting real-time updates by text. The mediator, a retired judge named Elaine Morgan, began by establishing ground rules. We would focus on legal facts first, then move to potential resolutions. Emotional statements would be redirected to focus on interests rather than positions. Everyone would have equal opportunity to speak without interruption. After introductions, Susan presented our position first. The deed clearly established me as a joint owner. My financial contribution was well documented. There had been no written agreement indicating temporary ownership, and Massachusetts law supported my 1/3 interest in the property. Harold responded with an argument about family understanding and implied agreements that sounded weak even to my untrained ear. When Judge Morgan asked for documentation of this implied agreement, Harold acknowledged there was none. The turning point came when Susan revealed information we'd only recently discovered through the legal discovery process. We have evidence, she said, sliding documents across the table, that Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell attempted to remove Ms. Mitchell's name from the deed last month without her knowledge or consent. This action was flagged and halted by the Registry of Deeds due to the requirement for all owners to consent to such changes. My parents exchanged a look I couldn't interpret. Harold's expression remained professionally neutral, but a slight flush crept up his neck. Judge Morgan reviewed the documents carefully, her expression growing increasingly severe. Mr. Preston, she said finally, were you aware of this attempted transfer? Harold cleared his throat. I advised against it, Your Honor. I suggested we address the matter through proper legal channels. Yet it was attempted anyway, Judge Morgan noted, turning to my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, this action suggests you were aware of your daughter's legal interest in the property and attempted to circumvent it rather than address it directly. That significantly undermines your position that her ownership was merely temporary or a formality. Dad started to speak, but Mom placed a restraining hand on his arm. For the first time, I saw something new in her expression. Not anger or disappointment, but uncertainty. Perhaps even the first glimmer of recognition that they might have been wrong. The mediation continued with technical discussions of property, law, and potential resolutions. Throughout it all, I maintained my composure, speaking only when addressed directly, focusing on facts rather than the emotional undercurrents threatening to pull me under. During a brief recess, I overheard Harold speaking quietly but intensely to my parents in the hallway. This isn't going your way, he said. The deed is irrefutable. The attempted transfer looks very bad. I strongly advise considering her settlement offer. When we reconvened, there was a subtle shift in the room's energy. Dad seemed deflated, less combative. Mom kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between regret and reassessment. Harold requested a private conference with Judge Morgan, which lasted nearly 40 minutes. When they returned, Judge Morgan addressed us all. After reviewing the facts and applicable law, I believe there is a clear path forward. Ms. Mitchell has established legal joint ownership of the property. Any estate plan must account for this reality. However, I sense there may be room for a compromise that addresses both the legal requirements and the family's estate planning goals. She turned to me. Ms. Mitchell, would you be willing to consider alternatives to maintaining joint ownership, provided your financial interest is properly valued and protected? I looked at Susan, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. Yes, Your Honor. I've never wanted to disrupt my parents' estate planning. Unnecessarily, I simply want my legal interest and contribution to be fairly acknowledged. The judge nodded approvingly. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, are you willing to acknowledge your daughter's legal interest in the property and work toward a fair resolution that respects both her rights and your estate planning objectives? Mom answered before Dad could speak. Yes, we are. Her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. The following 2 hours involved detailed negotiations about property valuation, potential buyout terms, and tax implications. By late afternoon, we had reached a provisional agreement. My parents would purchase my interest in the property based on current market value. The funds would be placed in a separate trust from the small one originally offered, and the settlement would include a formal acknowledgement that I had been a legal owner since the deed was modified 7 years ago. As we prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. James's wife, Catherine, was waiting in the lobby. She approached me hesitantly while my parents were still gathering their things. Becca, she said quietly, I want you to know that not everyone in the family thinks you're wrong to stand up for yourself. James won't admit it, but this has made him question some things about how your parents handle family matters. I was so surprised I barely managed to thank her before she hurried away, clearly not wanting my parents to see her speaking to me. That evening, alone in my apartment, I received the first direct text from Olivia in weeks that wasn't accusatory or manipulative. This isn't how any of us wanted things to go, but maybe it needed to happen. Can we talk sometime? Just us? It wasn't an apology, but it was an opening, a small crack in the wall of family unity against me that had seemed impenetrable for months. I replied simply, I'd like that. The legal documents were finalized over the next 2 weeks. My 1/3 interest in the family home was valued at $600,000, significantly more than the $300,000 trust fund originally offered in the will. More importantly than the money was the principle, the acknowledgement in writing that my contribution had been real, valuable, and legally significant. It wasn't full acceptance into the Mitchell family legacy as defined by my parents, but it was something I had earned on my own terms, through standing up for myself rather than accepting what others decided I deserved. 1 year later, I stood in the center of my new brownstone in Boston's South End, watching late afternoon sunlight stream through the bay windows I'd fallen in love with at first viewing. The settlement money had made this possible, a home entirely my own, designed precisely to my taste without compromise or consultation. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents' attempt to minimize my place in the family had ultimately funded my complete independence from them. The house was a work in progress, each room reflecting my journey over the past year. The living room was finished first, warm, welcoming, with comfortable seating arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal entertaining. The dining room featured a large table that could seat 12, because I decided to create my own definition of family, one that included friends and chosen connections alongside blood relatives. The home office showcased my design awards and professional achievements without apology or minimization. And the guest room, decorated but rarely used, stood as a symbol of boundary setting, a space for visitors I chose to welcome rather than obligations I felt compelled to fulfill. My relationship with my family had evolved in ways I never expected. The initial silence after the settlement had gradually given way to tentative communication. Mom called monthly now, our conversations carefully navigating around certain topics but gradually becoming less strained. We had established a new pattern, lunch every other month at a restaurant midway between our homes, neutral territory where we were both on our best behavior. Dad remained more distant, still struggling with what he perceived as a challenge to his authority, but he had sent a birthday card last month with a handwritten note that said simply, "Your new designs in Architectural Digest were impressive. You've built something worthwhile." From him, this qualified as effusive praise. James had been the slowest to reconnect. His sense of family loyalty ran deep, and he'd interpreted my stand as a betrayal of that loyalty rather than an assertion of my own worth. Catherine had become an unexpected bridge between us, occasionally sending photos of their children or updates on family news. 2 months ago, he'd reached out directly for the first time, asking if I would consider designing a playroom addition for their home. No one else would understand the space the way you would, he'd said, an acknowledgement of my professional expertise that felt like the beginning of a new kind of respect. Olivia had surprised me the most. Our sisters-only lunch had turned into a monthly tradition, and during our third meeting, she'd confessed something unexpected. I always envied your freedom, she said, picking at her salad. Mom and Dad had such specific expectations for me. Medical school, specialization, the right kind of practice. You chose your own path. I know they made it harder for you, but you did it anyway. I admire that more than you know. The revelation had shifted something fundamental in our relationship, allowing us to see each other more clearly than we had in decades. My professional life had transformed as well. The confidence I'd gained from standing up for myself extended to my business decisions. I'd rebranded my design firm, focusing exclusively on projects that aligned with my vision rather than trying to please everyone. Somewhat ironically, this selectivity had made my services more in demand. A profile in Boston Magazine had described my work as thoughtfully assertive, a phrase that seemed to apply to my personal evolution as well. Perhaps the most meaningful change was the support group I'd started for people navigating family estate conflicts. What began as an informal gathering of 5 people sharing similar experiences had grown into a monthly meeting of over 20, with an online community that included members across the country. We provided emotional support, practical advice, and sometimes just a safe space to share experiences without judgment. Leading this group had become an unexpected form of healing, transforming my personal pain into a resource for others. On this particular evening, as I prepared to host friends for dinner, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed since that Sunday afternoon in my parents' study. The journey had been far more difficult and painful than I could have imagined. There had been moments when the weight of family disapproval had felt unbearable, when I'd questioned whether asserting my rights was worth the cost. But standing in my own home, surrounded by the life I'd built on my own terms, the answer was unequivocally yes. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stand firm in your own worth, even when those who should value you most fail to do so. I'd discovered that family legacy isn't just what's handed down to you, it's also what you choose to create for yourself. I'd realized that self-respect isn't selfish, it's necessary. And perhaps most importantly, I'd found that healing doesn't require forgiveness from others. It comes from forgiving yourself for all the times you accepted less than you deserved. The doorbell rang, announcing my first guests of the evening. As I moved to answer it, I passed the small frame deed to my new home, displayed prominently in my entryway. Unlike the family home deed with 3 names, this one bore only mine, Rebecca Ann Mitchell, owner. Not of a share in someone else's legacy, but of something entirely my own. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against people you love? It can be one of the hardest things we ever do, but sometimes it's necessary for our own well-being. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story in the comments below. Have you experienced family dynamics where you felt undervalued? How did you handle it? Remember that recognizing your own worth is never selfish. It's essential. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more real-life experiences and lessons. Thank you for listening, and I hope you find the strength to honor your own value in all your relationships.